Hi, I'm Natalie Brooks. For 26 years, my family called me the dreamer, the sensitive one, the girl who lived in her head. At dinner tables across Austin, they'd roll their eyes when I'd get emotional about my art, about rejection letters, about anything that mattered to me. My mother, Patricia, would sigh that theatrical sigh and say, "Stop being so dramatic, Natalie. Life isn't some movie where everything works out for the artist." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But last Tuesday night, when I walked into Romano's Italian bistro, wearing a simple black dress and carrying nothing but my purse, everything changed. The moment I sat down at our usual corner table, Victoria, my younger sister, smirked and said, "Let me guess, another gallery rejected your paintings?" Before I could answer, Mom cut in with her favorite line. "Maybe it's time to consider something more practical, honey." That's when I pulled out my phone and showed them the email. The subject line read, "Congratulations, acquisition offer approved." The sender was Harrison Blackwood, Senior Acquisitions Director at Meridian Contemporary Arts. The number at the bottom made Victoria's fork clatter against her plate. Mom's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. My father, Kenneth, who hadn't looked up from his steak all evening, finally raised his eyes. $2.7 million. For a single piece. The painting they'd watched me work on in Grandfather Thomas's old studio, the one they said was just another waste of canvas and time. But here's what they never understood about the girl they called dramatic. Sometimes the quiet ones are the ones who change everything. The truth is, I'd been building toward this moment for 3 years. Ever since Grandfather Thomas passed away and left me his art studio in the warehouse district of East Austin. My family thought it was just another one of his sentimental gestures, giving the artsy granddaughter a place to play with paints. They had no idea what that studio really contained, or what Grandfather Thomas had been teaching me during all those Saturday afternoons they assumed were just an old man indulging a child's hobby. Growing up in Cedar Park, our family dinners were performances of normalcy. Patricia would set the table with her good china, Kenneth would carve whatever meat was the centerpiece, and Victoria and Marcus would compete for who could share the most impressive achievements from their respective careers in finance and law. I was the afterthought, the daughter who painted pictures instead of profit margins, who cried at movies and wrote poetry in coffee shop corners. The pattern started early. When I was 12 and won first place in the regional young artists competition, Mom's response was to remind me that art wasn't a real career. When I got accepted to the University of Texas art program, she suggested I double major in business, just in case. When I graduated and moved into a small apartment in South Austin to pursue painting full-time, the family dinners became intervention sessions disguised as casual catch-ups. Victoria would arrive in her BMW, fresh from closing another real estate deal, and regale us with stories of 6-figure commissions. Marcus would video call from Dallas, where his law firm had just made him junior partner at 28. Kenneth would nod approvingly and ask detailed questions about their clients, their strategies, their 5-year plans. Then all eyes would turn to me, sitting at the end of the table in my thrift store dress and paint-stained cardigan, and the questions would come. "How's the art going, Natalie? Any sales this month? Have you thought about teaching? Maybe getting a real job while you pursue this as a hobby?" The words were always delivered with concern, never cruelty, but they cut deeper than outright dismissal would have. This was death by 1,000 kindnesses, each suggestion wrapped in love but carrying the clear message that my choices were mistakes they were patiently waiting for me to outgrow. The worst part wasn't the questions. It was the way they'd changed the subject when I tried to explain what I was working on, the techniques I was exploring, the galleries I was submitting to. My father would suddenly remember something urgent about his insurance business. Victoria would check her phone and announce she had to return an important call. Mom would start clearing dishes even though we hadn't finished eating. They'd trained themselves not to hear me when I talked about the thing that mattered most. 6 months ago, the dismissal reached a breaking point. I'd been working on a series of paintings inspired by Grandfather Thomas's stories about growing up in rural Colorado, pieces that combined traditional landscape techniques with abstract emotional expression. The work was deeply personal, exploring themes of memory, loss, and the way landscape shapes identity. I'd spent 8 months on the series, pouring everything I had into canvases that seemed to breathe with life. When I brought photos of the paintings to Sunday dinner at Mom and Dad's house, I was genuinely excited. The compositions were stronger than anything I'd done before, the colors more confident, the emotional impact undeniable. I spread the photos across the dining room table after we'd finished eating, my hands trembling slightly with nervous energy. "This is what I've been working on," I said, arranging the images so they could see the progression from piece to piece. "It's called Echoes of Home, and it's about how the places we come from stay with us even when we can't return to them." Kenneth glanced at the photos briefly, then picked up his coffee cup. "They're very colorful," he said, which was his standard response to anything artistic. Victoria leaned in closer, squinting at the images with the same expression she used to evaluate property listings. "I don't really get what they're supposed to be," she said. "Like, is that one supposed to be a mountain or just random paint splatters?" But it was Mom's reaction that broke something inside me. She looked at the photos for a long moment, then sighed and started stacking them into a neat pile. "They're lovely, honey, but don't you think you're being a bit—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Don't you think you're making this whole art thing more dramatic than it needs to be? All these deep meanings and emotional expressions. Sometimes a painting is just a painting." The tears came before I could stop them. Not the delicate, socially acceptable kind of crying, but the ugly, soul-deep sobs of someone whose heart has been dismissed one too many times. I tried to explain that these weren't just paintings to me, that they represented months of exploration and growth, that each piece contained pieces of my grandfather's stories and my own search for meaning. "Stop being so dramatic," Mom snapped, her voice sharp with frustration. "You always do this, Natalie. You turn everything into some grand, emotional production. It's just paint on canvas. If you put half the energy you spend on these feelings into something practical, you might actually make something of yourself." The room went silent. Victoria stared at her phone. Marcus, who'd been listening on video call, suddenly developed urgent business elsewhere. Kenneth retreated behind his newspaper. And I sat there, tears streaming down my face, surrounded by photos of work that meant everything to me and family, who saw it as nothing more than an expensive hobby getting out of hand. That night, I drove to Grandfather Thomas's studio and sat surrounded by his easels and canvases until sunrise. The space still smelled like turpentine and coffee, still held the energy of countless hours spent in conversation about color theory and composition, and the way art could capture truths that words couldn't touch. I picked up one of his old brushes and started painting, not from any plan or concept, but from pure emotional necessity. What emerged over the following weeks was different from anything I'd created before. The piece started as an abstract expression of grief and frustration. But as I worked, it evolved into something more complex. Layers of meaning built up like sediment, each session adding new dimensions to the composition. Grandfather Thomas had always said that the best art happened when technique served emotion rather than the other way around, and for the first time I understood what he meant. The painting became a visual autobiography of sorts, incorporating elements from his Colorado stories, fragments of Austin landscapes, and abstract representations of family dynamics. I worked on it obsessively, often staying in the studio until dawn, pushing the boundaries of what I thought I was capable of. When it was finished 3 months later, I knew it was the best thing I'd ever created, but I had no idea what to do with it. That's when Riley Chang entered my life. I'd met Riley at a coffee shop in the Arts District, where she'd complimented the small watercolor sketch I was working on while waiting for my order. She introduced herself as a curator, working with galleries in New York and Los Angeles, someone who traveled constantly looking for emerging artists whose work deserved broader recognition. We started meeting regularly for coffee, and she became the first person in years who really listened when I talked about my art. Riley understood the technical aspects of what I was trying to achieve, but more importantly, she grasped the emotional core of the work. She saw the connections between pieces, recognized the evolution in my technique, and believed in the potential she saw developing. When I finally showed her the large piece I'd been working on, her reaction was immediate and visceral. She stood in front of it for nearly 10 minutes without speaking, taking in every detail, every layered meaning. When she finally turned to me, her eyes were bright with excitement. "Natalie," she said quietly, "this is museum-quality work. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I rarely see pieces that combine technical mastery with emotional depth like this. You need to start thinking bigger than local galleries." Over the following months, Riley became my advocate and guide through a world I'd never imagined accessing. She connected me with photographers who specialized in documenting artwork, helped me develop an artist statement that captured the essence of what I was trying to communicate, and introduced me to collectors and curators who moved in circles far beyond Austin's local art scene. The process was both exhilarating and terrifying. I'd spent so many years being told my work was a hobby that the idea of it being taken seriously by serious people felt like stepping into someone else's life. Riley was patient with my doubts and fears, but she was also relentless in pushing me to recognize the value of what I'd created. "Your family's inability to see what you're doing doesn't diminish its worth," she told me one afternoon as we sat in the studio looking at my growing portfolio. "Their limitations aren't your reality."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The validation from Riley and the art world professionals she introduced me to was intoxicating, but it also created a strange double life. During the day, I'd be on calls with galleries in New York and Los Angeles, discussing exhibition possibilities and pricing strategies. In the evening, I'd sit at family dinners where the conversation centered around Victoria's latest real estate success or Marcus's courtroom victories, while I smiled and nodded and said nothing about the transformation happening in my own career. I told myself I was protecting them from disappointment if nothing came of these opportunities. I convinced myself that keeping quiet was kinder than raising hopes that might be crushed. But the truth was more complicated. Part of me wanted them to discover my success on their own, to realize they'd been wrong about me without me having to prove it to them. Part of me wanted the satisfaction of seeing their faces when they understood what they'd missed. The call from Harrison Blackwood came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was in the studio, working on a new piece, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Harrison introduced himself as Senior Acquisitions Director at Meridian Contemporary Arts, one of the most prestigious galleries in the country. Riley had submitted my work to their Emerging Artists program 6 months earlier, but I'd heard nothing back and assumed it was another rejection. "Ms. Brooks," Harrison said, his voice warm but professional, "I'm calling about the piece you submitted titled Convergence of Memory. I want to be direct with you. This is exceptional work. We'd like to acquire it for our permanent collection." The rest of the conversation passed in a blur of details about contracts and timelines and publicity. But the number he mentioned, the figure they were offering, made my knees weak. $2.7 million. For one painting. For work my family had dismissed as dramatic indulgence. When I hung up the phone, I sat in Grandfather Thomas's old chair and cried. Not the frustrated tears I'd shed at family dinners, but tears of validation, of dreams realized, of potential finally recognized. I thought about all the times I'd been told to be practical, to stop dreaming, to find something real to do with my life. I thought about the painting itself, hanging in my studio, soon to be displayed in one of the most important galleries in the world. But mostly, I thought about dinner that Tuesday night, and the family who had no idea their dramatic daughter had just become one of the most successful emerging artists in the country. The restaurant was crowded when I arrived, the usual mix of Cedar Park families and young professionals from Austin proper. Romano's had been our go-to spot for family dinners for years, the kind of place where the servers knew our orders and the atmosphere was casual enough for Kenneth to feel comfortable loosening his tie. I'd chosen it deliberately for this moment, wanting the revelation to happen somewhere familiar, somewhere they felt safe and unsuspecting. Victoria was already at our usual corner table, scrolling through her phone with the focused intensity she brought to everything. She looked up as I approached, taking in my simple black dress and understated jewelry with the quick assessment she used to evaluate everything about everyone. "You look nice," she said, though her tone suggested she was already calculating the cost of the outfit and finding it wanting. "Special occasion?" "Just felt like dressing up," I replied, sliding into the chair across from her. The truth was, I'd chosen every element of my appearance carefully. The dress was elegant, but not flashy. The jewelry subtle but real. I wanted to look successful without appearing to be trying too hard. Confident without seeming to be making a point. Tonight was about revelation, not confrontation. Mom and Dad arrived together, Patricia in the navy blue blazer she wore to important dinners. Kenneth in the same style of shirt he'd been buying for 20 years. They settled into their chairs with the comfortable efficiency of people who'd been married for 32 years, ordering their usual drinks without consulting the menu. The conversation started predictably. Victoria talked about a commercial property she was representing. A deal that could net her a substantial commission if it closed before the end of the year. Kenneth nodded approvingly and asked the kinds of detailed questions that showed he was genuinely interested in her success. Mom chimed in with suggestions about networking opportunities and professional development. Then attention turned to Marcus, who called in from Dallas as usual. His face appeared on Victoria's phone propped against a water glass, and he launched into an update about his latest case, a corporate litigation matter that was making local news. The family leaned in, engaged and supportive, asking thoughtful questions and celebrating his victories. Finally, inevitably, the focus shifted to me. Patricia turned with the slightly forced smile she used when transitioning to topics she found less interesting. "And how are things with you, Natalie? Still painting away in that studio?" The dismissive tone was so familiar I almost didn't register it anymore. Still painting away, as if art were something children did to pass time rather than a serious pursuit worthy of respect. I could have responded with the usual deflections, the vague updates that revealed nothing and invited no follow-up questions. Instead, I smiled and pulled out my phone. "Actually," I said, opening my email app, "I got some interesting news today." Victoria glanced up from her own phone with mild curiosity. Kenneth continued cutting his steak. Mom sipped her wine and waited for me to share whatever small victory or minor disappointment had marked another day in my impractical career. I turned my phone so they could see the screen. The email from Harrison Blackwood open and clearly visible. The Meridian Contemporary Arts logo was prominent at the top, professional and unmistakable. The subject line, "Congratulations, acquisition offer approved," sat in bold text above the message. "What is this?" Victoria asked, leaning forward to read more clearly. I watched their faces as they processed the information. The sender's title, Senior Acquisitions Director. The gallery name, Meridian Contemporary Arts. The formal language of the email, full of terms like permanent collection, and acquisition agreement, and publicity coordination. And then, in the final paragraph, the number that changed everything. $2.7 million. For the painting they'd watched me work on, the piece they'd dismissed as another example of my dramatic indulgence. Victoria's fork, halfway to her mouth with a bite of chicken, froze in midair. The color drained from her face as she read the email again, as if the numbers might change if she looked long enough. Patricia's wineglass stopped moving toward her lips, suspended in space while she processed what she was seeing. Kenneth looked up from his steak for the first time all evening, his expression shifting from polite interest to focused attention. On the phone screen, Marcus leaned closer to his camera, trying to read the email from his end. "Is this real?" Mom whispered, her voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. I took the phone back and scrolled down to show them the formal offer letter attachment, the detailed terms and conditions, the signature line where Harrison Blackwood had already signed on behalf of the gallery. Every element of the document radiated legitimacy and significance. "It's real," I said quietly. "They want the painting for their permanent collection. The piece I've been working on for the past 8 months, the one you said was just random paint splatters." Victoria set her fork down carefully, as if sudden movements might disturb the reality that was reshaping itself around our table. $2.7 million, she said, more to herself than to anyone else. For one painting. For one painting that I created in Grandfather Thomas's studio, I confirmed. The studio you all thought was just a sentimental gesture, where I'd been wasting time playing with paints. The silence that followed was unlike any I'd experienced with my family. Not the usual uncomfortable quiet that followed my emotional outbursts. Not the polite pause before conversation moved to more interesting topics. This was the silence of worldviews shifting, of assumptions crumbling, of three people simultaneously realizing they'd been fundamentally wrong about someone they thought they knew completely. Patricia was the first to find her voice. "I don't understand," she said. Though what she really meant was that she understood perfectly and couldn't reconcile it with everything she'd believed about my choices. "How did this happen? When did this happen?" "It's been happening for 3 years," I replied. "Ever since Grandfather Thomas died and left me the studio. He wasn't just indulging my hobby during those Saturday visits. He was teaching me, mentoring me, helping me develop the skills and vision that made this possible." I thought about those afternoons in the warehouse studio, the way Grandfather Thomas would guide me through color theory and composition, while sharing stories from his own brief career as an artist, before family obligations forced him into more practical work. He'd never achieved the recognition he'd dreamed of, but he'd passed his knowledge and passion to me, nurturing talents the rest of the family had dismissed as childish fantasies. "But you never said anything," Victoria protested. "You never mentioned galleries or collectors or any of this. Would you have listened?" I asked, the question hanging in the air between us. "When was the last time any of you asked about my work without immediately following up with suggestions about teaching jobs or backup careers?" Kenneth cleared his throat, the sound rough with discomfort. "We were trying to be practical," he said. "We were looking out for you." "You were protecting yourselves from having to take me seriously," I replied, not with anger but with the calm certainty of someone who'd finally found solid ground. It was easier to dismiss my choices than to consider the possibility that I might know something about my own potential that you didn't. The conversation continued in fits and starts, my family struggling to reconcile this new reality with their established understanding of who I was and what my life meant. Victoria asked detailed questions about the gallery, the acquisition process, the implications for my career. Mom wanted to know about the painting itself, suddenly interested in the artistic vision she'd dismissed months earlier. Kenneth inquired about the business side of art, approaching my success from the angle he understood best. But underneath their questions and comments, I could sense the deeper recalculation happening. Every dismissive comment they'd made, every suggestion that I be more practical, every eye roll when I got emotional about my work, was being re-examined in light of this new information. The daughter they'd seen as dramatic and impractical had just achieved something none of them had imagined possible. As we finished dinner and prepared to leave, Patricia pulled me aside in the restaurant parking lot. The October air was cool, carrying the scent of barbecue from a food truck down the street and the sound of live music from a nearby venue. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We all do. We thought we were being helpful, being realistic about your chances. But we were really just scared." "Scared of what?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Scared of watching you fail," she admitted. "Scared of seeing you pour your heart into something that might not work out, and having to watch you get hurt. It seemed easier to encourage you towards something safer than to support you in taking risks that might not pay off." I understood the impulse, even as I recognized how it had shaped my experience of family support. Their fear of my potential failure had prevented them from seeing my actual success. Their desire to protect me from disappointment had made them agents of that disappointment. "The thing is, Mom," I said gently, "I did fail, many times. I got rejected by dozens of galleries, had paintings that didn't work, spent months on pieces that never found an audience. But I also kept working, kept growing, kept believing in what I was doing even when it seemed like nobody else did." She nodded, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. "And we weren't there for any of it, not the failures or the successes." "You're here now," I said, which was both true and not quite enough, but felt like a place to start. As I drove home to my small apartment in South Austin that night, I thought about the conversation, about the shock on their faces, about the way success had suddenly made my choices retroactively valid in their eyes. Part of me felt vindicated, finally seen and appreciated for who I really was. But another part felt sad about what we'd all missed, the years of connection that had been lost to their fears and my own need to prove myself. The real drama, I realized, hadn't been in my emotional responses to their dismissal. The real drama had been in the quiet transformation happening in that warehouse studio, in the evolution of skills and vision that had prepared me for this moment. While they'd been focused on the external signs of what they considered success, I'd been building something internal and powerful that they'd never thought to look for. Tomorrow, I would call Riley and start planning for the next phase of my career. I would work with Harrison and his team to prepare for the exhibition where my painting would debut. I would continue creating art that mattered to me, regardless of anyone else's opinion about its practicality or value. But tonight, I sat in Grandfather Thomas's studio, surrounded by canvases and brushes and the lingering scent of turpentine, and allowed myself to feel proud of what I'd accomplished. Not just the sale, not just the recognition, but the years of persistence that had made this moment possible. The girl they'd called dramatic had turned out to be the most practical of all, investing in her own potential when nobody else would. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to protect me from the drama of artistic failure, they'd missed the real drama of artistic success. And now, finally, they were ready to see what I'd been building all along. The phone call started the next morning. Victoria called at 7:30, her voice tight with the kind of controlled urgency she used when closing difficult deals. She wanted details, specifics about the gallery, about the painting, about how long this had been developing without anyone knowing. Kenneth followed up an hour later with questions about contracts and tax implications, his insurance background kicking in to analyze the financial aspects of what had happened. But it was Mom's text message that caught me off guard. Instead of calling, she sent a simple question that arrived while I was making coffee in my small kitchen. "Can I see the painting?" I stared at the message for a long time, remembering all the times I'd invited them to visit the studio, to see what I was working on, to understand the space where I spent most of my waking hours. The invitations had been politely declined or accepted with visible reluctance. Brief visits where they'd nod appreciatively at whatever piece I showed them before finding reasons to leave quickly. Now, suddenly they wanted to see. Now that the work had been validated by someone else's money, it had become worthy of their attention. The irony was sharp, but underneath my frustration was something else. Relief, maybe. Or hope that this moment might open a door that had been closed for years. I replied that they could come by the studio whenever they wanted, then spent the morning cleaning and organizing the space. Not because it was messy, but because I wanted it to look professional when they arrived. I wanted them to see it as a real workplace, not just a hobby room where their impractical daughter played with paints. The warehouse district felt different as I drove through it that afternoon. The same industrial buildings lined the streets, the same food trucks and coffee shops anchored the corners, but something about my relationship to the space had shifted. Yesterday, this had been where I worked in relative obscurity, known only to the small community of artists who rented studios in the converted buildings. Today, it was where a $1 million artist had her workspace. Riley was waiting outside the building when I arrived, leaning against her car with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who had news to share. She'd been fielding calls all morning from galleries and collectors who had somehow already heard about the Meridian acquisition. "Word travels fast in this world," she said, handing me one of the cups. "Harrison's team put out a press release this morning, and my phone hasn't stopped ringing. There are 3 other galleries that want to discuss representation, and at least 5 collectors asking if you have other pieces available." The information felt surreal, like we were discussing someone else's career rather than mine. 48 hours ago, I'd been an unknown artist working in relative isolation. Now, suddenly, I was in demand. "How do you handle this part?" I asked as we walked toward the building entrance. "The business side, the attention, all these people suddenly interested in your work?" Riley smiled, the expression of someone who'd guided other artists through this transition. "Carefully," she said. "Success can be as challenging as failure, just in different ways. The important thing is to stay connected to why you started making art in the first place, and not let the market define your creative decisions." We spent an hour going through my current inventory, photographing pieces that might interest the collectors Riley had heard from, discussing pricing strategies and exhibition possibilities. The conversation was practical and professional, focused on building a sustainable career rather than just capitalizing on a single success. But underneath the business discussion was a deeper question that neither of us voiced directly. How do you maintain your artistic integrity when the world suddenly wants to buy what you're selling? How do you stay true to your vision when that vision has become valuable to other people? My family arrived just as Riley was leaving. I watched through the studio windows as they parked and gathered on the sidewalk, looking around the warehouse district with the curiosity of tourists visiting an unfamiliar neighborhood. Victoria had her phone out, probably checking property values or researching the area's development potential. Mom and Dad stood close together, their body language suggesting they weren't entirely comfortable with the industrial setting. I met them at the building entrance, leading them up the narrow stairway to the third floor where my studio occupied a corner space with large windows facing east and south. The afternoon light was good, golden and warm as it streamed across the concrete floors and white-painted walls. They entered quietly, taking in the organized chaos of an active workspace. Canvases lined the walls in various stages of completion, some barely sketched, others nearly finished. Paint tubes and brushes covered a long table near the windows. The easel where I'd worked on the Meridian piece stood empty now, but still held traces of the colors I'd mixed during those final sessions. Patricia walked slowly around the perimeter of the room, stopping in front of each canvas, studying the work with an attention I'd never seen her bring to my art before. Her usual quick glances and polite comments were replaced by genuine looking, the kind of careful observation that suggested she was actually trying to understand what she was seeing. Victoria was drawn to a series of smaller pieces I'd been working on as studies for larger compositions. Abstract landscapes that captured the emotional essence of places rather than their literal appearance. She stood in front of them for several minutes, tilting her head as she tried to decode the visual language I was using. Kenneth found himself drawn to the corner where I kept Grandfather Thomas's old tools and supplies. His easel, barely used, but still functional. His palette, stained with decades of color mixing. His books on technique and art history, pages yellowed, and margins filled with his handwritten notes. "I never knew he was serious about this," Kenneth said, picking up one of the books and flipping through it carefully. "I mean, I knew he painted sometimes, but I thought it was just a retirement hobby." "He was serious about it long before retirement," I replied. "He just never had the freedom to pursue it the way he wanted to. By the time he could focus on art, he was already in his 70s. But he never stopped learning, never stopped growing as an artist." I pulled out a folder of his work, paintings and drawings he'd created during our Saturday sessions. Landscapes from his Colorado childhood, portraits of family members, abstract compositions that explored color relationships and emotional expression. The technical skill was evident, but more importantly, each piece radiated the passion of someone creating art because he couldn't help himself. "He was teaching me his entire approach," I continued, "not just techniques, but philosophy. How to see, how to translate vision into visual form, how to keep working, even when nobody else understands what you're trying to achieve." Mom had found the painting I'd completed most recently, a smaller piece that explored similar themes to the Meridian acquisition but with a more intimate scale. She stood in front of it without speaking, her expression cycling through emotions I couldn't quite read. "This is the one they bought?" she asked quietly. "No, that one's already been delivered to their conservation department. This is part of the same series, though. Similar ideas, similar approach." She nodded slowly, continuing to study the piece. The painting combined realistic elements with abstract passages, creating a visual narrative about memory and place that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Looking at it through her eyes, I tried to see what she was seeing, to understand how someone without art training might interpret the visual information I was presenting. "I don't understand all of it," she said eventually, "but I can feel something when I look at it. Like you're telling me a story, but in a language I don't quite speak." The admission surprised me. Mom had always approached my art with the same practical analysis she brought to everything else, looking for literal meaning and clear purpose. This was the first time I'd heard her acknowledge the emotional component of visual art, the way paintings could communicate feelings and ideas that existed beyond words. "That's exactly what I'm trying to do," I said. Tell stories that can only be told visually. Explore ideas that don't translate directly into language. Victoria joined the conversation, gesturing toward the series of smaller pieces she'd been studying. These are all connected to each other, aren't they? Like chapters in a book, or movements in a symphony. I nodded, pleased that she'd picked up on the relationships between pieces. They're all exploring different aspects of the same larger theme. How places shape us, how memory transforms over time, how we carry our origins with us even when we travel far from home. That's what Grandfather Thomas was teaching you, Kenneth said, looking up from the books he'd been examining. Not just how to paint, but how to think about what painting could do. The recognition in his voice was new, acknowledgement of complexity and purpose in what I was doing. For the first time, they seemed to understand that my art wasn't just self-expression or creative indulgence, but a serious investigation into ideas and experiences that mattered to me. We spent another hour in the studio, the conversation gradually shifting from explanation to genuine curiosity. They asked questions about my process, about how long individual pieces took to complete, about the relationship between the abstract and realistic elements in my work. Victoria wanted to know about the business side, how galleries operated, how collectors made decisions about what to buy. Mom was most interested in the emotional aspects of the work, how I decided what feelings or experiences to explore in each piece. She asked about specific color choices, about why I'd included certain visual elements, about how I knew when a painting was finished. Their questions revealed how much they'd missed during all those years of polite disinterest. They were discovering not just my work, but my way of thinking about the world, my approach to solving visual problems, my commitment to ideas that extended far beyond the practical concerns that usually dominated our family conversations. As they prepared to leave, Patricia pulled me aside near the windows where the late afternoon light was beginning to fade. The warehouse district was coming alive for the evening, restaurants and bars preparing for dinner crowds, artists heading home after long days in their studios. I need to tell you something, she said, her voice lower than usual. Watching you here, seeing all of this, it's making me realize how wrong we were about what you were doing. But more than that, it's making me remember things I'd forgotten about myself. She paused, looking out at the street below where people moved with the easy confidence of those who belonged in this creative community. I used to write poetry when I was younger. Nothing serious, nothing I thought was any good. But it mattered to me. When your father and I got married, when we started having children, it seemed like there wasn't time for that kind of thing anymore. The revelation caught me off guard. I'd never heard her mention writing, never seen any evidence of creative interests in our house growing up. The practical, efficient woman I knew as my mother had once been someone who wrote poetry, who understood the pull of creative expression. What happened to it, I asked. Life happened. Responsibilities, practical concerns, the need to focus on things that mattered more. She laughed softly, but the sound carried sadness rather than humor. At least, things I thought mattered more. Now I'm wondering if I was just scared, the same way we were scared for you. Scared of what? Scared of failing at something that mattered too much. Scared of discovering I wasn't as good as I hoped I might be. Scared of the vulnerability that comes with creating something and putting it out into the world for other people to judge. I understood the fear she was describing. Had felt it myself during every submission to galleries, every attempt to share work that felt too personal to expose to criticism. The difference was that I'd learned to work through the fear rather than letting it stop me entirely. You could start writing again, I said. It's never too late to reconnect with something that used to matter to you. She nodded thoughtfully, but I could see the practical side of her mind already calculating obstacles and complications. Decades of prioritizing efficiency over creativity had trained her to see artistic pursuits as luxuries rather than necessities. Maybe, she said. Right now, I think I need to understand what I missed with you. I want to learn about art, about what you're doing, about this world you've been building while we weren't paying attention. The offer felt like the beginning of a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than protective concern. She was asking to be educated rather than assuming she already understood what I needed. After they left, I stayed in the studio as darkness settled over the warehouse district. The space felt different after their visit, somehow more complete. For 3 years, it had been my private sanctuary, the place where I could work without judgment or interference. Now it had been witnessed by the people whose approval I'd craved and resented in equal measure. Their reaction had been better than I'd hoped, but also more complicated than I'd expected. The validation felt good, but it came with the realization of how much we'd all missed during the years of miscommunication and misunderstanding. They were genuinely interested in my work now, but that interest was largely motivated by its financial success rather than its artistic merit. I pulled out my phone and called Aunt Helen, who answered on the second ring with the warmth and directness that made her my favorite family member. She'd heard about the gallery acquisition from Mom, who'd called her immediately after dinner the previous night. "I'm proud of you, mija," she said, using the Spanish endearment she'd picked up from her late husband's family. "But I'm not surprised. I always knew you had something special, something that went beyond what the rest of them could see." Helen had been different from the beginning, the family member who asked real questions about my art, who remembered details from previous conversations, who treated my creative work as seriously as she treated Victoria's real estate career or Marcus's legal practice. She'd visited the studio several times over the years, not out of obligation but from genuine interest. "They want to understand now," I told her. "But I'm not sure how to help them understand something they ignored for so long." "Be patient with them," she said. "And be patient with yourself. Family relationships are like paintings sometimes. You work on them layer by layer, and sometimes you have to paint over mistakes before you can create something beautiful." Her advice resonated as I cleaned up the studio and prepared to head home. The success with Meridian was just the beginning of a larger transformation, not just in my career but in how my family saw me and how I saw myself in relation to them. The next few days brought a steady stream of professional opportunities and family conversations. Riley scheduled meetings with 2 additional galleries interested in representing my work. Harrison from Meridian called to discuss the timeline for exhibiting my piece and the promotional campaign they were planning around my emergence as a significant new artist. But the family calls continued too, each member processing the revelation in their own way. Marcus flew in from Dallas for the weekend, wanting to see the studio and understand what he'd been missing during his video call appearances at family dinners. He approached my art with the same analytical precision he brought to legal research, asking detailed questions about technique and artistic influences. Victoria surprised me by asking if she could bring some of her clients to visit the studio. Several of them were collectors or people with cultural interests who might appreciate seeing an artist's workspace. The request represented a shift in how she saw my work, from embarrassing family hobby to potential business opportunity. Kenneth showed up one afternoon with a folder full of research he'd conducted about art as investment, tax implications of major art purchases, and insurance considerations for valuable artwork. His practical mind was working to understand the business ecosystem I'd entered, finding ways to be helpful within his areas of expertise. The attention was gratifying but also overwhelming. After years of working in relative solitude, suddenly everyone wanted to be involved in my artistic career. They brought enthusiasm and support, but they also brought expectations and advice that sometimes felt more constraining than encouraging. The real test came when Harrison called to discuss the exhibition opening where my painting would be displayed for the first time. Meridian was planning a significant event, inviting major collectors, art critics, and other artists whose work they represented. It would be my formal introduction to the upper levels of the art world, the moment when I'd transition from emerging artist to established professional. "We'd like to invite your family, of course," Harrison said during our phone conversation. "The opening is as much about celebrating you as an artist as it is about unveiling the new acquisition. Having your support system there would add to the personal narrative of the evening." The invitation represented everything I'd wanted during those years of family dinners where my work was dismissed or ignored. Now my family would be present for one of the most important moments of my career, witnessing my recognition by the people who mattered most in the art world. But it also represented a kind of pressure I wasn't sure I was ready for. Would they understand the significance of the event? Would they be comfortable in that sophisticated cultural environment? Would their presence enhance the evening or create additional stress as I tried to manage both professional obligations and family dynamics? I said yes to including them in the invitation, but spent the following days wondering if I'd made the right choice. The gallery opening would be the culmination of everything I'd been working toward, the moment when years of private effort became public achievement. Having my family there would complete the circle, but it would also add complexity to an evening that was already going to be emotionally intense. The invitation arrived by courier 3 days later, heavy cardstock with elegant typography announcing the exhibition and my piece's debut. I stared at my name printed in the same font used for established artists whose work I'd admired for years, trying to process the reality of what was happening. I called Mom first, reading her the invitation details and explaining the significance of the event. Her response was immediate and enthusiastic, but I could hear the nervousness underneath her excitement. She asked what she should wear, whether there would be dinner, how long the event would last, whether she'd need to talk to important people. The questions revealed how foreign this world was to her, how little any of us had prepared for the possibility that my art might lead to this kind of recognition. They wanted to be supportive, but they were also stepping into territory none of us understood completely. Victoria's response was characteristically practical. She researched Meridian Contemporary Arts, studying their website and recent exhibitions, preparing herself to understand the context of my achievement. She asked intelligent questions about the gallery's reputation, the other artists they represented, the likely attendance at the opening. Kenneth's concerns were financial and logistical. He wanted to understand the tax implications of the sale, whether I needed additional insurance, how the gallery's promotional efforts might affect my future earning potential. His questions revealed both genuine care and a fundamental difficulty understanding art as anything other than a business venture. Marcus arranged to fly in from Dallas for the event, treating it with the same importance he'd give to a major court appearance. His legal training had taught him to prepare thoroughly for significant occasions, and he approached my gallery opening with the same methodical attention to detail. Their responses were touching and frustrating in equal measure. They were genuinely trying to be supportive, but their support was filtered through their own professional perspectives and social anxieties. They wanted to be helpful, but they didn't quite know how to help with something they'd never encountered before. The week leading up to the opening was a blur of final preparations and mounting anticipation. Riley and I met with Harrison to discuss the evening's schedule and my role in the proceedings. I would give a brief talk about the painting and my artistic process, participate in conversations with collectors and critics, and generally represent myself as a serious artist worthy of the gallery's investment. The pressure felt enormous, not just to perform well professionally, but to justify my family's newfound belief in my abilities. They were coming to see me succeed in a world they'd never imagined I could enter. Their presence would validate my achievement, but it would also create witnesses to any failure or misstep. 2 days before the opening, I received an unexpected call from someone I hadn't heard from in months. Dr. Sarah Winters, my former art history professor from UT, had seen the announcement about my Meridian exhibition and wanted to congratulate me personally. "I always knew you had exceptional potential," she said, her voice warm with genuine pride. "But even I didn't predict you'd achieve this level of recognition so quickly." The art world can be unforgiving to emerging artists, but when talent meets opportunity and preparation, magical things can happen. Dr. Winters had been one of my most influential teachers, someone who'd helped me understand art not just as personal expression but as cultural conversation. She'd introduced me to artists whose work challenged conventional thinking, encouraged me to develop my own voice rather than imitating established styles. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. "Not just the opening, but everything that comes after. Success in the art world creates as many challenges as it solves." Her question struck at the heart of my anxiety about the upcoming event. I felt prepared for the technical aspects of the evening, confident in my ability to discuss my work and artistic philosophy. But the larger implications of success, the way it might change my relationship to my art and my family, felt less manageable. "I think so," I said. "But honestly, I'm not entirely sure what I'm supposed to be ready for." She laughed, the sound carrying memories of classroom discussions about artistic careers and creative integrity. "Nobody ever feels completely ready for their breakthrough moment. The important thing is to stay connected to why you started making art in the first place. Success can be seductive, but it can also be distracting from the real work of being an artist. Her advice echoed Riley's earlier warnings about maintaining creative independence in the face of commercial success. The art world was full of cautionary tales about artists who'd lost their way after achieving recognition, who'd allowed market demands to reshape their vision until their work became formulaic and soulless. The conversation helped me clarify what I wanted from the opening and from my career moving forward. Recognition was gratifying, but it wasn't the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal was to continue making art that mattered to me, art that explored ideas and emotions too complex for other forms of expression. With that clarity came a sense of calm about the evening ahead. My family would be there to witness my achievement, but their presence wasn't the source of that achievement's meaning. The painting hanging in Meridian's gallery was valuable not because someone had paid millions for it, but because it represented the culmination of years of serious artistic investigation. That realization felt like the real victory, more significant than the financial success or professional recognition. I'd become the artist I'd always hoped to be, someone whose work commanded respect, not through compromise or calculation, but through commitment to authentic creative expression. The morning of the opening dawned clear and bright, Austin's October weather providing the perfect backdrop for an evening that would change everything. The elevator at Meridian Contemporary Art moved with whisper-quiet precision, carrying me toward the gallery's main floor, where my painting would be displayed for the first time. Through the glass walls, I could see the downtown skyline of Manhattan glittering in the early evening light, a view that would have intimidated me just weeks ago but now felt like confirmation that I belonged in this rarefied world. Harrison met me at the elevator doors, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my rent. His smile was genuine, the expression of someone who genuinely believed in the evening ahead and in the artist he was about to introduce to New York's cultural elite. "You look perfect," he said, taking in my carefully chosen outfit. The black dress was elegant but not flashy, professional but not corporate. Riley and I had spent hours selecting every detail, from the vintage jewelry that suggested sophistication to the confident but approachable hairstyle that would photograph well for the art magazines that would cover the evening. "The painting looks incredible in the space," Harrison continued as we walked toward the main gallery. "The lighting designer worked all afternoon to get the illumination perfect. When people see it tonight, they're going to understand immediately why we made such a significant investment." We paused at the entrance to the main gallery, and I got my first glimpse of the space that would define this chapter of my career. The room was larger than I'd expected, with soaring ceilings and white walls that seemed to glow under carefully positioned spotlights. My painting hung on the far wall, commanding attention even in a room filled with other significant works. Seeing it there, professionally mounted and perfectly lit, was surreal. The piece I'd created in Grandfather Thomas's Austin warehouse studio now occupied the same visual space as works by artists I'd studied in graduate school, names that appeared in art history textbooks and museum exhibitions around the world. "How do you feel?" Harrison asked, watching my reaction to seeing the painting in its new context. "Proud," I said, surprising myself with the simplicity and honesty of the response. "And grateful. And maybe a little terrified." He laughed, the sound warm and reassuring. "That's exactly how you should feel. If you weren't at least a little nervous, it would mean you didn't understand the significance of what's happening here tonight." The next hour passed in a blur of final preparations and introductions to key staff members. The gallery's director, a formidable woman named Catherine Morrison, who spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room, briefed me on the evening's schedule and the notable guests who would be attending. "There will be critics from the major publications," she explained, "collectors who've been following emerging artists, and several museum curators who specifically requested invitations after hearing about the acquisition. The goal is to establish you not as a one-hit wonder, but as a serious artist with a sustainable career trajectory." The pressure was enormous, but it was also energizing. This wasn't just about celebrating one successful sale, but about launching a professional identity that could support decades of creative work. Everything I'd learned from Riley about navigating the art world, every conversation with Grandfather Thomas about artistic integrity, Every moment of doubt I'd overcome in the studio had led to this opportunity. Riley arrived just as the catering staff began setting up bars and display tables throughout the gallery. She looked elegant in a deep blue dress that complemented her role as my representative without competing for attention. Her presence was immediately calming, a reminder that I had an advocate who understood both the business and creative sides of what we were trying to accomplish. "Your family just arrived," she said, gesturing toward the gallery's entrance where I could see Victoria, Kenneth, Patricia, and Marcus clustered together, looking around the space with expressions of fascination and slight bewilderment. They were dressed appropriately for the occasion, clearly having researched what one wore to New York gallery openings, but their body language revealed how foreign this environment felt to them. Victoria kept checking her phone, probably researching the other artists whose work surrounded them. Kenneth stood with the careful posture of someone trying not to accidentally damage something valuable. Patricia moved slowly through the space, taking in details with the intense focus of someone trying to memorize an experience she'd never expected to have. Marcus looked the most comfortable, his legal training having prepared him for formal events where networking and professional conversation were expected. But even he seemed slightly overwhelmed by the sophisticated cultural atmosphere that surrounded us. I walked over to greet them, and the pride in their faces was unmistakable. Whatever doubts or concerns they'd harbored about my artistic career had been completely transformed by the reality of seeing my work displayed in such a prestigious context. "Natalie," Mom said, pulling me into a hug that was warmer and more emotional than our usual family greetings. "I can't believe this is really happening. I can't believe you created something that belongs here." The comment stung slightly, carrying the implication that my previous work hadn't been worthy of serious attention. But I understood what she meant. The scale and prestige of this moment was beyond anything any of us had imagined possible when I was struggling to sell paintings at local Austin galleries. Victoria was studying the wall placard next to my painting, which provided information about the piece and a brief artist biography. Seeing my name and accomplishments presented in the same format used for internationally recognized artists was clearly impacting her understanding of what I'd achieved. "This is incredible," she said, gesturing around the gallery. "I had no idea places like this existed, let alone that you'd be showing your work in them." Kenneth was examining the other paintings in the room, trying to understand the context in which my work was being presented. His practical mind was working to process the economic ecosystem that supported this level of cultural activity, the complex web of galleries, collectors, and institutions that made careers like mine possible. "How much are these other pieces worth?" he asked quietly, obviously curious about the financial landscape I'd entered. Riley stepped in smoothly, explaining the gallery's role in representing established artists, the way auction results influenced market values, and the long-term career development that separated successful artists from those who achieved only temporary recognition. Her explanation helped my family understand that my success wasn't accidental, but the result of entering a sophisticated professional network that could support sustained artistic development. As more guests began arriving, the gallery filled with the sophisticated hum of art world conversation. I recognized several faces from photographs and art magazines, critics whose reviews could make or break careers, collectors whose purchases influenced market trends. The energy was both inspiring and intimidating, a reminder of how much was riding on my ability to make a strong impression. Harrison introduced me to Dr. Michael Chen, the chief curator at the Whitney Museum, who had specifically requested to meet me after learning about the acquisition. Dr. Chen was in his 50s, with the quiet intensity of someone who spent his days thinking seriously about contemporary art and its cultural significance. "I'm very interested in your work," he said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "The piece Meridian acquired demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of how contemporary painters can engage with landscape traditions while developing distinctly personal visual languages." His analysis of my work was more insightful than most of the criticism I'd received from local reviewers, evidence of the elevated level of discourse I was entering. He asked detailed questions about my artistic influences, my relationship to the Texas landscape that appeared in many of my pieces, and my plans for future development. The conversation was exhilarating but also exhausting, requiring me to articulate ideas about my work that I'd never had to express so formally. Every response felt significant, as if I were establishing the critical framework through which my career would be understood going forward. Across the room, I could see my family observing these interactions with fascination. They were witnessing a version of me they'd never encountered, someone who could discuss complex artistic concepts with confidence and authority. The daughter they'd seen as impractically emotional was holding her own in conversations with some of the most respected figures in contemporary art. Victoria caught my eye and gave me a subtle thumbs up, her approval carrying special weight because of how rarely she'd expressed confidence in my choices. Kenneth and Patricia were talking quietly with Riley, asking questions about the art market and the business aspects of gallery representation. Marcus had struck up a conversation with another guest about the legal complexities of art authentication and ownership, finding ways to contribute to the evening's discussions through his own professional expertise. Watching them engage with the art world through their respective lens of understanding was touching and slightly surreal. As the evening progressed, the conversations became more relaxed and the atmosphere less formal. Critics began approaching me with specific questions about technique and artistic philosophy. Collectors inquired about upcoming work and availability of pieces from related series. One conversation in particular stood out. Eleanor Hartwell, a collector known for supporting emerging artists who later achieved major museum recognition, spent nearly 20 minutes discussing the emotional content of my work and its relationship to contemporary landscape painting. "What interests me most about your approach," she said, "is how you use abstraction to intensify, rather than obscure the emotional content of landscape. Many contemporary painters use non-representational techniques to create distance from their subjects, but you seem to use them to create intimacy." Her observation was perceptive, identifying something about my work that I'd felt intuitively but never articulated clearly. The conversation helped me understand my own artistic development more clearly, providing language for describing what I was trying to achieve in each piece. "I think landscape painting has always been about more than just documenting places," I replied. "It's about capturing the emotional experience of being in relationship with particular environments. Abstraction lets me paint not just what a place looks like, but what it feels like to be there." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, and I could see her mentally cataloging my response for future reference. Collectors like her weren't just buying art for aesthetic reasons, but investing in artists whose work they believed would remain culturally significant over time. The formal presentation began just after 8 o'clock, with Catherine Morrison addressing the assembled guests about Meridian's commitment to supporting emerging artists and the significance of the evening's featured acquisition. Her introduction was gracious but substantial, positioning my work within broader contexts of contemporary painting and cultural dialogue. When she called me forward to speak about the piece, I felt the weight of every gaze in the room. This was the moment that would define how the art world understood my work and my potential as a serious artist. Everything I'd learned from years of developing my voice, every conversation with Grandfather Thomas about the responsibility of making art, every private moment of doubt and determination, had prepared me for these next few minutes. I spoke about the painting's origins in my grandfather's stories, and my own exploration of how memory transforms landscape over time. I explained my techniques for combining realistic and abstract elements, the way different passages of the painting operated on different emotional registers. But mostly I talked about the deeper questions that drove my work. How do we carry the places that shaped us when we can no longer return to them? How do physical landscapes become internal emotional territories? How can painting explore the invisible connections between environment and identity? The audience listened with the focused attention of people accustomed to serious cultural discourse. I could see critics taking notes, collectors evaluating not just the work but my ability to articulate its significance, museum professionals considering how my approach might fit within their institutional missions. When I finished speaking, the applause was warm and sustained, but more importantly, the questions that followed were sophisticated and engaged. People wanted to know about my artistic development, my relationship to other contemporary painters working with similar themes, my plans for future exhibitions. The evening continued for another 2 hours, with conversations flowing between art and business, creativity and commerce, personal vision and public recognition. I found myself moving easily between different types of discussions, comfortable talking about technical aspects of painting with other artists, market considerations with collectors, and cultural significance with critics and curators. My family stayed until the end, observing every interaction and gradually understanding the professional community I'd become part of. By the time the evening concluded, they seemed less overwhelmed by the sophistication of the environment and more proud of how naturally I fit within it. As guests began departing, several approached me with business cards and invitations to future events. Dr. Chen mentioned the Whitney's Emerging Artist Program. Eleanor Hartwell asked about scheduling a studio visit. 3 different galleries expressed interest in representing me for future exhibitions. The success was beyond anything I'd imagined when Riley first suggested submitting work to Meridian's acquisitions program. But the real significance wasn't in the professional opportunities or the financial implications. It was in the recognition that my work was contributing to ongoing cultural conversations about landscape, memory, and identity. After the last guests departed, my family and I stood in the now quiet gallery, looking at my painting hanging among works by artists whose names I'd studied in art history classes. The contrast between the bustling energy of the opening and the peaceful aftermath created space for reflection on what had just occurred. "I owe you an apology," Patricia said, breaking the silence. "We all do. We thought we were being practical when we discouraged you from pursuing this seriously, but we were really just afraid of disappointment, and our fear kept us from seeing what you were actually capable of achieving." Her acknowledgement meant more than the critical praise or collector interest I'd received during the evening. This was recognition from the people who mattered most, admission that their previous judgments had been based on their own limitations, rather than accurate assessment of my potential. Victoria nodded, still looking slightly stunned by the evening's events. "I had no idea this world existed, or that you were ready to be part of it. Watching you tonight, talking with all those important people like you belonged there, it made me realize how much I'd underestimated what you were working toward." Kenneth's response was characteristically practical but no less meaningful. "I've been thinking about the business side of what you're doing, and I realize I was asking the wrong questions. Instead of worrying about whether art was a viable career, I should have been asking how I could help you succeed in the career you'd already chosen." Marcus, joining the conversation via video call from his phone, added his own perspective as someone who understood professional achievement. "What impressed me most wasn't just the success, but how prepared you were for it. You handled every conversation like someone who'd been working in this field for years, not someone just entering it." Their responses revealed how fundamentally their understanding of me and my choices had shifted. The daughter they'd seen as impractically emotional had demonstrated expertise, professionalism, and long-term strategic thinking. The art career they'd dismissed as unrealistic was revealing itself to be more sophisticated and sustainable than their own more conventional professional paths. Riley, who had been coordinating with Harrison about follow-up activities, rejoined our conversation with updates about media coverage and collector interest. Art Forum wanted to schedule an interview. 2 museums had inquired about including my work in upcoming group exhibitions. Several collectors were interested in commissioning pieces. The trajectory was accelerating faster than anyone had expected, creating opportunities that would need to be carefully managed to support long-term career development rather than just capitalizing on immediate attention. As we prepared to leave the gallery, I took one last look at my painting in its new context. Tomorrow, it would become part of Meridian's permanent collection, available to be studied by future artists, critics, and art lovers who might find in it something meaningful about landscape, memory, or the complex relationships between place and identity. But tonight, it represented something more personal, proof that the quiet, sensitive girl my family had worried about had grown into an artist capable of contributing to cultural conversations that mattered. Evidence that, following my instincts and maintaining faith in my vision, even when it required working in isolation, had led to recognition I couldn't have imagined. The elevator descended quietly through the gallery building, carrying us back to street level and the beginning of whatever came next. Through the windows, Manhattan's lights sparkled with the energy of a city that never stopped creating, buying, selling, and transforming culture into commerce, and commerce back into culture. I thought about Grandfather Thomas, and what he would have said about seeing his granddaughter's work hanging in such prestigious company. He would have been proud, but not surprised. He'd always believed that talent combined with persistence could overcome the limitations others tried to impose. The real drama, I realized, hadn't been in my emotional responses to family criticism or my tears over their lack of understanding. The real drama had been in the quiet transformation happening in that warehouse studio, in the development of skills and vision that prepared me for opportunities I hadn't even known existed. My family's inability to see what I was building hadn't diminished its value or delayed its recognition by people qualified to judge it. Their recent conversion to believing in my potential was gratifying, but it wasn't necessary for my success. I'd learned to find validation in the work itself and in the response of people who understood what I was trying to achieve. The evening had been perfect, but its perfection lay not in external recognition or professional advancement. It lay in the confirmation that spending years developing authentic artistic voice, despite discouragement from people who claimed to love me, had been the right choice all along. As we stepped out onto the Manhattan sidewalk, the contrast between the gallery's refined atmosphere and the city's raw energy was striking. Both environments felt like places where I could thrive, spaces where creativity and ambition intersected in productive ways. The girl who had been called too dramatic for crying over her family's dismissal had become an artist whose emotional intelligence and technical skills commanded respect from the most sophisticated cultural institutions in the world. That transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had happened completely. Tomorrow, I would begin the next phase of a career that was just getting started. But tonight I allowed myself to feel proud of how far I'd traveled, from those painful family dinners in Austin to this moment of recognition in New York. The journey had been worth every tear, every doubt, every moment of working alone while others questioned my choices. The real drama was just beginning. The morning after the gallery opening, I woke up in my hotel room overlooking Central Park with 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The New York Times had published a review of the exhibition that mentioned my work specifically, calling it a sophisticated entry into contemporary landscape dialogue by an artist worth watching. Art in America had posted photos from the evening online, including several of me speaking with prominent collectors and curators. But the message that caught my attention was from someone I hadn't heard from in over a year. Chelsea Morrison, my former roommate from art school, who had dropped out junior year to pursue what she called more realistic career options in marketing. Her text was short but loaded with meaning. Saw the article. Guess you were right about the art thing after all. The irony wasn't lost on me. Chelsea had been one of the voices encouraging me to consider more practical alternatives when I'd committed to pursuing painting seriously after graduation. She'd meant well, offering the same kind of protective advice my family had given, but her message now carried the uncomfortable weight of someone realizing they'd bet on the wrong horse. I was still processing the flood of responses when Riley called with news that would reshape everything again. "The Times review has created a feeding frenzy," she said, her voice buzzing with excitement and careful professionalism. "I've had calls from 6 galleries in the past 3 hours. The Museum of Fine Arts in Houston wants to discuss a solo exhibition, and there's something else you need to know about." She paused in a way that suggested the something else was significant. "Harrison got a call this morning from a private collector who owns one of the most important contemporary art collections in the country. She saw your work last night and wants to commission a large-scale piece for her estate in Colorado. The budget she's proposing is, well, it's substantial." "How substantial?" $4.2 million. For a single commissioned work. The number hung in the air between us, representing a level of financial success that put me in a category of artists I'd only dreamed of joining. More than the money, though, it represented recognition from someone whose judgment could influence how museums and critics viewed my work for decades to come. "Her name is Margaret Thornfield," Riley continued. "She's been collecting contemporary art for 30 years. Her estate houses works by artists who are now in major museum collections worldwide. She doesn't commission work lightly, and she's very selective about the artists she supports." I spent the next hour researching Margaret Thornfield online, trying to understand what kind of person had just offered to invest millions in my artistic vision. What I found was impressive and slightly intimidating. She was a retired investment banker who had transitioned into full-time art collecting and patronage. Her Denver estate was frequently mentioned in architectural and art magazines as one of the most significant private collections in the western United States. The commissioned piece she wanted would become part of a landscape that included works by artists whose names I'd studied in graduate school textbooks. The pressure to create something worthy of that company was enormous, but so was the opportunity to establish myself as an artist whose work commanded serious institutional attention. My phone rang while I was still absorbing the implications of Riley's news. It was Victoria, calling from Austin with a tone I'd never heard from her before. Excitement mixed with something that sounded like panic. "Natalie, you need to see what's happening here," she said without preamble. Mom forwarded the New York Times article to everyone she knows. Dad's been calling his insurance clients to tell them about your success. The local news station wants to do a story about you. And there's something else. She paused, and I could hear traffic in the background suggesting she was calling while driving, which she never did unless something urgent was happening. "Remember Jessica Hartwell from high school? The one who always made comments about your clothes and your art projects? She posted something on social media about how she always knew you had talent, how she supported your artistic dreams back in school." The revisionist history was both predictable and frustrating. Jessica had been one of the classmates who'd made subtle but cutting remarks about my unconventional interests, part of a social dynamic that had made high school an exercise in defensive creativity. Now apparently my success had transformed her into a supportive friend who had always believed in my potential. "But that's not the worst part," Victoria continued. "Mrs. Davidson, your old high school art teacher, is scheduling interviews with reporters about how she nurtured your talent and always knew you'd achieve greatness." Mrs. Davidson had been competent but uninspiring, someone who taught basic techniques without encouraging students to develop personal artistic voices. She'd rarely shown interest in my work beyond ensuring I followed assignment parameters correctly. The idea of her claiming credit for my development was particularly galling, because she'd actively discouraged experimentation in favor of conventional approaches to drawing and painting. "Everyone wants to be part of your story now," Victoria said. "People who ignored you or dismissed you are suddenly remembering how supportive they were, how they always recognized your potential." The phenomenon wasn't surprising, but it was disorienting. Success had apparently transformed my past, making people who had been indifferent or dismissive into early supporters who deserved credit for my achievements. The narrative was being rewritten in real time, with former skeptics repositioning themselves as prescient believers. But the call that really unsettled me came that afternoon, just as I was preparing to return to Austin. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice was immediately recognizable despite the years that had passed since I'd heard it. "Natalie? This is Professor Williams from UT. I hope you remember me from your graduate seminars." I remembered him clearly. Professor Williams had been the faculty member who'd suggested I consider switching to art education instead of pursuing studio art, arguing that my work wasn't conceptually sophisticated enough for serious gallery representation. He'd been polite but consistently dismissive, the kind of academic who seemed to believe that genuine artistic achievement required theoretical complexity over emotional authenticity. "I saw the news about your Meridian exhibition," he continued, his tone suggesting he was genuinely pleased by my success. "I wanted to reach out and congratulate you. I always knew you had exceptional potential." The lie was so blatant it took my breath away. Professor Williams had not only failed to recognize my potential, he'd actively discouraged me from pursuing the path that had led to this success. His graduate seminar critiques had been exercises in intellectual intimidation, designed more to demonstrate his theoretical sophistication than to help students develop their artistic voices. "I was wondering if you might be interested in giving a guest lecture to my current graduate students," he continued. "They could benefit enormously from hearing about your experience navigating the contemporary art market. And of course, the department would be honored to have such a successful alumna share her expertise." The department that had barely tolerated my presence as a student now wanted to claim me as evidence of their educational excellence. The professor who had questioned my conceptual rigor now wanted me to validate his program with my professional achievement. I managed to respond politely, saying I'd consider the invitation, but the conversation left me feeling manipulated and slightly disgusted. Success was apparently retroactively transforming everyone who had encountered me into supporters and mentors, regardless of their actual behavior or attitudes. The flight back to Austin gave me time to process the strange experience of having my past reinterpreted through the lens of present success. People who had been indifferent or dismissive were now claiming relationships and influence they'd never actually exercised. Former skeptics were presenting themselves as early believers who deserved credit for nurturing my talent. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the individual acts of revisionist history. It was the systemic way that success had made my previous struggles invisible. The years of working without support, the emotional cost of pursuing art despite consistent discouragement, the isolation of developing artistic voice in an environment that questioned its value, all of that was being erased by a narrative that emphasized the support and encouragement I'd supposedly always received. Marcus met me at the Austin airport, offering to drive me home from what he described as his, quote, big sister's triumphant return. His enthusiasm was genuine and touching, but it was also complicated by the knowledge that his newfound pride in my achievements came after years of polite indifference to my struggles. "I've been thinking about what you said at the gallery," he said as we drove through Austin's familiar streets. "About us not really listening when you talked about your work. I realize now that we were so focused on the practical aspects of career building that we missed the actual substance of what you were creating." His acknowledgement was more thoughtful than I'd expected, revealing genuine reflection rather than just excitement about my newfound success. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about why recognition from strangers had been necessary to make my own family take my work seriously. "The thing is," I replied carefully, "the work was always substantial. The vision was always there. What changed wasn't the quality of what I was doing, but other people's ability to see it." "I know," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry it took external validation for us to recognize what you were achieving. That says something about us that I'm not proud of." His honesty was appreciated, but it also highlighted the fundamental problem with family relationships that required outside authorization to function properly. Love should have been enough to create interest and support, but apparently it had taken professional success to make my artistic work worthy of serious attention. When I arrived at my apartment in South Austin, I found the space exactly as I'd left it, but somehow everything felt different. The modest furnishings and small rooms that had felt cozy before now seemed almost absurdly humble given the trajectory my career was taking. The contrast between my living situation and my professional success created a strange cognitive dissonance. I was still adjusting to being back when Aunt Helen called with news that put the entire situation into stark perspective. "Mija, I need to tell you something that happened today," she said, her voice carrying the tone she used when delivering information she knew would be upsetting. "Patricia called me this morning crying. Really crying, the kind I haven't heard from her since you were a child." Aunt Helen paused, letting me prepare for whatever she was about to reveal. "She told me she's been lying awake at night thinking about all the times she dismissed your work, all the moments she could have been supportive but chose to be practical instead. She said she realizes now that her fear of you failing kept her from seeing that you were actually succeeding." The image of my mother crying over her treatment of my artistic ambitions was both gratifying and heartbreaking. Part of me felt vindicated, finally receiving acknowledgement of the emotional cost of years of subtle discouragement. But another part felt sad that it had taken such dramatic success to make her realize the impact of her behavior. "She wants to make amends," Helen continued, "but she doesn't know how to approach you about it. She's afraid that apologizing now will seem self-serving, like she's only sorry because you turned out to be successful." The fear was well-founded. There was something hollow about apologies that came only after success made them socially necessary, rather than emotionally authentic. If my career had developed more slowly or achieved recognition through different channels, would she have ever reconsidered her approach to my artistic ambitions? But Helen's next words complicated my cynicism about family motivations. "There's something else you should know," she said. "Patricia went to your old studio yesterday, the one in the warehouse district. She spent hours there, looking at paintings you'd left behind, reading the journals you'd been keeping about your artistic development." This was news to me. I hadn't realized Mom even knew where the studio was located, let alone that she'd visited it independently. "She found sketches and notes from conversations with your grandfather, ideas you'd been developing over years that she'd never bothered to ask about. She told me she finally understood that you hadn't just gotten lucky with one successful piece. You'd been building toward this level of work for a long time, developing skills and vision that she'd been too distracted to notice. The revelation was significant, because it suggested Mom's regret wasn't just about missing out on celebrating my success, but about failing to understand the person I'd actually been while she was worrying about the person she thought I might become. She also found something else, Helen added. A letter you'd written but never sent, addressed to the family. It was about feeling unsupported and misunderstood, about working in isolation while the people who claimed to love you questioned your choices. I remembered that letter, written during a particularly difficult period when gallery rejections and family skepticism had combined to create overwhelming doubt about my artistic path. I'd never intended anyone to read it, using the writing process as a way to work through emotions that felt too complex and painful to share directly. Patricia said reading it made her realize how much pain she'd caused by trying to protect you from potential disappointment. She understood for the first time that her practical concerns had become emotional abandonment. The conversation with Helen continued for another hour, exploring the complex dynamics that had shaped my family relationships, and the way success was forcing everyone to reconsider assumptions they'd held for years. But the most important insight emerged gradually through our discussion. My family's inability to support my artistic ambitions hadn't been malicious or even consciously dismissive. They'd been operating from genuine love and concern, trying to protect me from what they saw as the inevitable disappointment of pursuing an impractical career. Their fear of my failure had prevented them from seeing my potential success, but their protective instincts had also revealed limitations in their understanding of who I was and what I was capable of achieving. They'd been so focused on conventional markers of success that they'd missed the actual development of skills and vision that would ultimately lead to recognition they couldn't have imagined. The real drama wasn't in my emotional responses to their skepticism, or in their current excitement about my achievements. The real drama was in the years of parallel development, their growing anxiety about my choices occurring simultaneously with my growing mastery of the craft that would justify those choices. Now that success had arrived, we all had to figure out how to rebuild relationships based on more accurate understanding of who I actually was, rather than who they'd been afraid I might become. Their newfound support was welcome but also complicated by the knowledge that it was contingent on external validation rather than unconditional acceptance. That evening, I drove to Grandfather Thomas's studio to think through everything that had happened. The space felt like a sanctuary, removed from the swirling dynamics of family guilt and professional opportunity. Surrounded by canvases and brushes and the lingering scent of turpentine, I could focus on the central question that would determine everything moving forward. How do you maintain authentic relationships with people whose support depends on your success? How do you rebuild trust with family members who've proven they need outside authorization to take your choices seriously? The questions were complex, but sitting in the space where I'd developed the artistic vision that had led to this moment, the answers began to emerge. My family's limitations hadn't prevented my success, they'd simply made it lonelier than it needed to be. Their current enthusiasm wasn't worthless, just because it had required dramatic validation to emerge. What mattered now was building forward from this point, creating relationships based on who we all were now, rather than who we'd been during the years of misunderstanding. Their regret was genuine, even if it had taken external events to trigger it. My success was real, even if it had been achieved without the support I'd wanted from them. The phone buzzed with another message from Riley, updating me on collector interest and exhibition possibilities. The professional momentum was accelerating, creating opportunities that would define the next decade of my career. But sitting in Grandfather Thomas's old chair, surrounded by the tools and materials that had made everything possible, I felt clear about what mattered most. The drama my family had dismissed as emotional indulgence had been the energy that fueled years of artistic development. The sensitivity they'd seen as impractical weakness had been the foundation of work that commanded respect from the most sophisticated cultural institutions in the world. They were learning to see me accurately now, but I'd learned to see myself clearly years ago. Their recognition was gratifying, but it wasn't necessary for my continued growth as an artist or as a person. The real victory wasn't in proving them wrong about my potential. It was in having developed the strength to pursue that potential despite their doubts, and the wisdom to forgive their limitations while protecting my own authentic path forward. Tomorrow would bring new conversations about family dynamics and professional opportunities, but tonight I allowed myself to feel proud of having stayed true to my artistic vision when it would have been easier to compromise. The girl who had been called too dramatic for crying over their dismissal had become a woman whose emotional intelligence powered work that changed how people thought about landscape, memory, and identity. That transformation hadn't happened because of their eventual support, or in spite of their initial skepticism. It had happened because I'd learned to find validation in the work itself, and in my own commitment to authentic creative expression. The real drama was just beginning, but this time I was writing the script. 6 months later, I stood in the great room of Margaret Thornfield's Colorado estate, watching workmen carefully position the commissioned piece I'd spent 4 months creating. The painting was larger than anything I'd attempted before, spanning nearly 12 feet of wall space, but the scale felt right for both the subject matter and the architectural setting. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Rocky Mountains stretched across the horizon in layers of blue and purple, the natural landscape providing a stunning backdrop for the artistic interpretation I'd created. Margaret had given me complete creative freedom, asking only that the piece engage with the environment where it would live while reflecting my ongoing exploration of memory and place. The commission had pushed my technical abilities in new directions, requiring me to develop approaches to color and composition that could hold their own against the dramatic natural beauty visible through the windows. But more than that, it had given me space to work through the complex emotions surrounding my family relationships and my own transformation from dismissed dreamer to recognized artist. Margaret herself was in her 70s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd made her fortune in investment banking before transitioning to full-time art collecting and philanthropy. Her approach to supporting artists was methodical and generous, based on long-term relationships rather than trendy acquisitions. "It's exactly what I hoped for," she said, studying the painting as the installation crew made final adjustments to the lighting. "You've captured something essential about this landscape without trying to compete with it. The abstraction amplifies rather than obscures the emotional content." Her response confirmed what I'd intuited during the months of working on the piece. The painting operated as a translation rather than a representation, converting the visual experience of mountain landscape into emotional and psychological territory that viewers could inhabit imaginatively. But the real significance of the commission extended beyond the artwork itself. Margaret had become a mentor whose guidance helped me navigate the complexities of sudden professional success. She understood the art world from multiple perspectives, having worked with artists, dealers, critics, and curators for decades. "The challenge now," she said as we walked through her collection, "isn't just maintaining the quality that brought you initial recognition. It's developing the intellectual and emotional depth that will sustain a career worth having." Her collection included works by artists who had achieved both commercial success and lasting cultural significance, pieces that had gained value over time because they continued revealing new meanings to successive generations of viewers. The standard was intimidating but also inspiring, providing clear examples of what art could accomplish when technical mastery served authentic vision. During my time in Colorado, I'd also been working on a series of smaller pieces, inspired by the landscape but rooted in my ongoing exploration of family dynamics and personal transformation. The mountains had provided new metaphorical territory for examining how environments shape identity and how physical displacement can create emotional clarity. One piece in particular had emerged from thinking about the view from Margaret's estate compared to the flat expanses of central Texas where I'd grown up. The contrast had triggered memories of conversations with grandfather Thomas about how landscape influences the development of artistic vision, how the places we inhabit become part of the way we see and think about the world. The painting combined realistic elements of mountain topography with abstract passages representing memory, displacement, and the complex process of understanding home from a distance. It was more personal than the commissioned work, exploring themes that had become central to my artistic development. Margaret had seen the piece during one of my working sessions and expressed interest in acquiring it for her collection. But rather than simply purchasing it, she'd proposed something more significant. She wanted to donate the piece to the Denver Art Museum as part of their permanent collection, with the understanding that it would be available for loan to other institutions for exhibitions focusing on contemporary landscape painting. The offer represented a level of institutional recognition I hadn't expected to achieve so quickly. Museum collections operated on different timelines than commercial galleries, focused on long-term cultural significance rather than immediate market trends. Having work acquired by a major museum suggested that my artistic development was being taken seriously by people who thought in terms of decades rather than seasons. But the professional opportunities, while gratifying, were becoming less central to my sense of purpose than the personal transformation I was experiencing. The months of working in relative isolation, surrounded by mountain landscape and supported by someone who understood the complexities of artistic career development, had provided space for reflection on everything that had changed since the Meridian acquisition. The success had been validating, but it had also revealed uncomfortable truths about the people I'd thought I knew, and the relationships I'd assumed were based on love rather than social expectations. Family members who'd dismissed my work for years were now eager to claim connection to my achievements. Former classmates and teachers were rewriting history to position themselves as early supporters who deserved credit for nurturing my talent. Even more disturbing was the realization that my own sense of self-worth had been more dependent on external validation than I'd wanted to admit. The financial success and critical recognition felt good, but they'd also highlighted how much I'd been seeking approval from people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered more than my own commitment to authentic creative expression. Margaret had helped me think through these complications during our conversations about art, career development, and the psychology of sudden success. Her perspective was informed by decades of watching artists navigate similar transitions, some successfully and others less so. The artists who sustain meaningful careers, she'd told me one evening as we watched sunset light transform the mountain landscape, are those who learn to find satisfaction in the work itself, rather than in external responses to the work. Recognition is gratifying, but it's also distracting from the real business of making art. Her advice echoed things Grandfather Thomas had said during our Saturday afternoon sessions, but coming from someone who operated at the highest levels of the art world, it carried additional weight. The challenge wasn't just maintaining technical excellence or developing marketable styles, but staying connected to the internal motivations that made creating art feel necessary, rather than merely professional. The phone call from Riley came while I was finishing the final details on the commission, bringing news that would test my ability to apply Margaret's guidance to specific professional decisions. "There's been a development with your family situation," she said, her tone suggesting the news was complicated rather than simply good or bad. "Your mother has been in contact with my office. She wants to commission a painting." The request was unexpected and emotionally loaded. Patricia had never shown serious interest in owning my work, and her sudden desire to commission a piece felt connected to my professional success rather than aesthetic appreciation. "What kind of painting?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would reveal motivations I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. "She wants a portrait of your grandfather's studio, specifically the way it looked when you were working there with him. She said she has photographs from visits she made but never paid attention to, and she wants to commemorate the space where your artistic development really began." The commission request was touching and problematic in equal measure. Patricia was asking me to create a visual memorial to the relationship that had shaped my artistic identity, acknowledging the significance of something she'd dismissed or ignored at the time. But she was also asking me to use my now valuable skills to process her own regret about not understanding what was happening while it was happening. "There's more," Riley continued. "She wants to donate the finished piece to the University of Texas Art Department, specifically to be displayed in the building where you took your graduate classes. She said she wants current students to understand that artistic development often happens outside academic environments, in relationships and spaces that might not look like traditional educational settings." The gesture was generous and insightful, recognizing both the importance of my relationship with Grandfather Thomas and the limitations of institutional art education. But it was also a very public way of acknowledging her previous failure to support my artistic development, a kind of apology that would be witnessed by future generations of art students. I told Riley I needed time to think about the request, but the conversation had raised questions that extended beyond family dynamics. How do you separate genuine artistic commissions from attempts to purchase forgiveness? How do you maintain professional boundaries with people whose personal relationships with you are complicated by years of misunderstanding? Margaret's advice, when I discussed the situation with her, was characteristically direct and thoughtful. "The question isn't whether your mother's motivations are pure," she said. "The question is whether creating the painting would serve your artistic development and contribute something meaningful to the world. If the answer is yes, her motivations become secondary." She paused, looking out at the mountain landscape that had become the backdrop for so many of our conversations about art and life. "But you should also consider whether accepting the commission would compromise your ability to maintain healthy boundaries with family members who are still learning how to relate to your success. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do is refuse requests that come from guilt rather than genuine appreciation." Her perspective helped me clarify my own feelings about the situation. Patricia's regret was real, and her desire to make amends was touching. But creating art to process other people's emotions about their treatment of me felt like a departure from the artistic vision that had brought me recognition in the first place. I called Riley back that evening and declined the commission, but I offered an alternative that felt more authentic. Rather than creating a painting about Grandfather Thomas's studio, I would write an essay about our relationship and the way his mentorship had influenced my artistic development. The essay could be published in an art journal and would be available to students and other artists interested in understanding how creative relationships develop outside traditional educational structures. The response felt right because it honored Patricia's desire to acknowledge the significance of my relationship with Grandfather Thomas, while maintaining the boundary between my artistic practice and my family's ongoing process of understanding their role in my development. But the real test of my ability to maintain those boundaries came 2 weeks later, when I returned to Austin for a family dinner that had been planned to celebrate my professional success. The gathering was different from our usual restaurant meals, hosted at Mom and Dad's house with extended family members invited to participate in what Patricia described as, quote, "a proper celebration of Natalie's achievements." The evening felt surreal from the moment I walked through the front door. The house was decorated as if for a major holiday, with flowers and candles creating an atmosphere of festivity I'd never associated with family gatherings. Relatives I hadn't seen in months had driven from across Texas to attend, creating a crowd that felt more like a wedding reception than a dinner party. Victoria greeted me with enthusiasm that seemed genuine, but also performed for the benefit of the assembled relatives who were witnessing her support for my career. Kenneth had prepared a speech about my artistic development that revealed he'd been researching contemporary art and my place within it, an effort that was touching but also highlighted how little attention he'd previously paid to my work. Marcus had flown in from Dallas with his wife and children, treating the evening as a significant family event worthy of disrupting professional obligations. His pride in my achievements was evident, but so was his discomfort with being surrounded by discussions of art and creativity, rather than the legal and business topics that usually dominated our conversations. But the most significant moment came when Patricia stood to address the assembled family, her voice carrying the formal tone she used for important announcements. "We're here tonight to celebrate Natalie's extraordinary achievements," she began, "but also to acknowledge that her success has forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about how we've supported her artistic ambitions over the years." The room quieted, sensing that this was more than standard celebratory rhetoric. "The truth is that we were scared," she continued. "Scared of watching her pursue something that seemed impractical. Scared of seeing her disappointed if it didn't work out. Scared of our own inability to understand what she was trying to achieve. Our fear made us less supportive than we should have been, and I want to apologize publicly for that failure." The acknowledgement was more direct and honest than I'd expected, revealing genuine reflection rather than just excitement about my success. But it also put me in the uncomfortable position of having to respond to public contrition in front of relatives who had been invited to witness this moment of family reconciliation. "I appreciate the acknowledgement," I said carefully, "and I understand that your concerns came from love even when they didn't feel supportive. But I also want to be clear that my artistic development happened because I learned to find validation in the work itself, not because I was waiting for external approval to make it worthwhile." The response was more direct than I'd planned, but it felt important to establish that my success hadn't been dependent on their eventual support. The years of working without encouragement had been difficult, but they'd also been necessary for developing the independence and authenticity that had ultimately led to recognition. The conversation that followed was more honest than most of our family discussions had ever been. Relatives asked questions about my artistic process, about the business aspects of the art world, about my plans for future development. But they also shared their own experiences of pursuing dreams that had been discouraged by practical concerns, creating connections I hadn't expected. Aunt Helen, who had been the most consistent source of family support throughout my development, made an observation that crystallized something important about the evening. "What impresses me most about Natalie's success," she said, "isn't just that she achieved recognition for her work. It's that she maintained her artistic integrity throughout the process. She didn't compromise her vision to make it more acceptable to people who were uncomfortable with what she was doing." Her comment highlighted something I'd been thinking about throughout the months of professional success and family reconciliation. The real victory wasn't in proving my family wrong about my potential, or in achieving financial success that validated my choices. It was in having developed the strength to pursue authentic creative expression, regardless of external support or discouragement. The evening concluded with family members expressing genuine interest in visiting my studio, attending future exhibitions, and learning more about contemporary art generally. Their enthusiasm was gratifying, but it was also complicated by the knowledge that this interest had required dramatic external validation to emerge. Driving home through Austin's familiar streets, I reflected on how much had changed since that dinner 6 months ago, when I'd revealed the Meridian acquisition. The external circumstances of my life were dramatically different, but the internal qualities that had made success possible, persistence, authenticity, willingness to work without immediate reward, remained the same. The real transformation hadn't been in my family's ability to see my potential, but in my own understanding of where validation should come from. Their recognition was welcome, but it was no longer necessary for my sense of purpose or self-worth. 3 months later, I was back in Grandfather Thomas's studio, working on a new series inspired by my experiences with sudden success and family reconciliation. The paintings explored themes of visibility and recognition, the way external validation could both illuminate and distort authentic artistic development. The work was more conceptually complex than anything I'd created before, incorporating elements of portraiture, landscape, and abstraction to examine how personal relationships influence creative expression. Each piece in the series considered different aspects of the same central question: how do you maintain authentic artistic vision when that vision becomes valuable to other people? Riley had been following the development of the new work with excitement, recognizing that it represented an evolution in my artistic approach rather than just a continuation of previously successful themes. The paintings were technically accomplished but also intellectually ambitious, engaging with ideas about creativity, commerce, and family dynamics that extended beyond personal experience to examine broader cultural questions. "This is museum-quality work," she said during one of her studio visits, "but it's also personally courageous. You're using your own experience of success and recognition as raw material for exploring universal themes about authenticity and external validation." Her observation helped me understand what I was trying to achieve with the new series. Rather than simply capitalizing on the style and subject matter that had brought initial recognition, I was using that success as a foundation for more ambitious artistic investigation. Margaret Thornfield, who had become an important advisor as well as collector, offered a different perspective when she saw the new work during a visit to Austin. "What excites me about this development," she said, "is that you're not trying to repeat previous successes. You're using recognition as a platform for taking bigger risks, for exploring more complex territory. That's what separates artists who have careers from those who just have moments." Her encouragement was particularly meaningful because it came from someone who understood the art world well enough to distinguish between work that was merely competent and work that was genuinely significant. The new series was technically challenging and conceptually ambitious, representing growth rather than just continuation. But the real validation came from my own sense of satisfaction with the work. These paintings felt necessary in a way that transcended commercial or critical considerations. They were exploring ideas and emotions that I couldn't express through any other medium, fulfilling the essential function that had drawn me to art in the first place. The studio itself had become a different kind of space over the months since the Meridian acquisition. Where it had once been a place of private struggle and development, it was now a professional workspace visited by collectors, critics, and other artists. The transformation was largely positive, but it had also changed the relationship between solitude and creativity that had been central to my artistic process. Grandfather Thomas's presence was still strong in the space, his tools and books providing continuity between the person I'd been when he was alive and the artist I'd become since his death. But the studio was no longer a sanctuary from external expectations. It had become part of a professional network that brought both opportunities and obligations. The challenge was maintaining the internal focus that had made significant work possible while engaging with the external demands that came with recognition. Success created its own kind of pressure, different from the pressure of working without support, but equally capable of distorting authentic creative expression. That tension came into sharp focus when Harrison called with news of a major exhibition opportunity. The Whitney Museum wanted to include 3 of my pieces in a survey of contemporary landscape painting that would tour internationally, visiting major museums in Europe and Asia over 2 years. The invitation represented the kind of institutional recognition that could establish my work within art historical contexts, making it available to audiences and critics worldwide. But it also meant creating work specifically for museum exhibition, with all the pressures and expectations that entailed. This is the opportunity that transforms emerging artists into established ones, Harrison explained during our phone conversation. The Whitney Survey exhibitions are closely watched by critics and collectors globally. Artists who participate often see their careers accelerate significantly. The opportunity was extraordinary, but it also forced me to confront questions about artistic integrity that I'd been avoiding. How do you create work for institutional exhibition without compromising the personal vision that made the work worthy of exhibition in the first place? Margaret's advice, when I consulted her about the opportunity, was characteristically direct. Create the work you need to create, she said. If it's suitable for museum exhibition, wonderful. If it's not, that's the museum's loss. Your responsibility is to maintain the authenticity that brought you recognition, not to modify it for broader acceptance. Her perspective reminded me of conversations with Grandfather Thomas about artistic courage and the importance of trusting internal creative instincts over external pressures. The work that had brought recognition had been created without consideration for museum exhibition or international touring. Its power had come from authenticity rather than calculation. I decided to accept the Whitney invitation, but to approach it as an opportunity to share work I was already creating, rather than as a commission to create work specifically for exhibition. The new series exploring success and recognition would provide pieces that engaged with themes relevant to contemporary culture, while maintaining connection to my ongoing artistic development. The decision felt right, because it honored both the significance of the opportunity and the integrity of my creative process. Rather than trying to create work that would impress museum audiences, I would let museum audiences encounter work that was already exploring questions central to my artistic vision. 6 months later, I stood in the Whitney's main gallery, watching visitors encounter my paintings in the context of a major survey exhibition. The work looked confident and substantial, surrounded by pieces from other artists whose careers I'd studied and admired. But more importantly, it felt like an authentic representation of my current artistic investigations. My family was there for the opening, having traveled to New York specifically to witness this milestone. Their presence felt different from their attendance at the Meridian exhibition 8 months earlier. Rather than being overwhelmed by the sophisticated cultural environment, they seemed genuinely interested in understanding my work and its place within broader contemporary art dialogue. Victoria had done extensive research about the other artists in the exhibition, approaching my success as part of a larger cultural conversation, rather than as an isolated achievement. Kenneth and Patricia asked thoughtful questions about museum collecting practices and the significance of international touring exhibitions. Marcus brought his children, wanting them to understand that their aunt was contributing to cultural discussions that would outlast any individual career. His pride was evident, but it was also informed by genuine appreciation for what I was trying to achieve artistically. But the most meaningful moment came when I overheard Patricia talking with another visitor about one of my paintings. Rather than simply identifying herself as the artist's mother, She was discussing the work's exploration of memory and landscape with someone who was genuinely interested in understanding the artistic concepts involved. The conversation revealed that her engagement with my work had evolved beyond family pride to include actual aesthetic appreciation. She wasn't just celebrating my success, she was learning to see what made the work worthy of celebration. Later that evening, at the reception following the exhibition opening, Patricia pulled me aside for a conversation that felt like the culmination of months of family reconciliation. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice carrying the weight of carefully considered thoughts. "Watching you tonight, seeing how confidently you discuss your work with critics and curators, it's making me realize how wrong we were about what you needed from us." She paused, looking around the gallery where my paintings hung alongside works by internationally recognized artists. "We thought we were protecting you by encouraging practical alternatives to art, but what you actually needed was for us to trust your vision and support your development. We were so afraid of watching you fail that we couldn't see you were actually succeeding." Her acknowledgement was more thoughtful than I'd expected, revealing understanding of the deeper issues involved in our relationship rather than just regret about missing my achievements. "The thing that impresses me most," she continued, "isn't just that you proved us wrong about your potential. It's that you maintained your artistic integrity throughout the process. You didn't compromise your vision to make us comfortable, and you didn't let our doubts distort your creative development." The observation was perceptive, recognizing something about my character that had been essential to achieving success worth having. The temptation to modify my work for broader acceptance had been constant, but maintaining authenticity had ultimately led to recognition that felt genuinely earned. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, "not just for achieving success but for achieving it on your own terms." The conversation felt like resolution, not because all the hurt from years of misunderstanding had been erased, but because we'd both learned something valuable about creativity, support, and the complex dynamics of family relationships. As the evening concluded and the Whitney exhibition began its international tour, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from dismissed dreamer to recognized artist. The external changes were dramatic, but the internal qualities that had made success possible remained constant. Persistence, authenticity, willingness to work without immediate reward, and faith in creative vision even when others couldn't see its value. The real drama hadn't been in my emotional responses to family criticism, or in their current celebration of my achievements. The real drama had been in the quiet transformation happening in studios and galleries and museums around the world, where artists were exploring ideas and emotions that couldn't be expressed through any other medium. My family had learned to see me accurately, but more importantly, I'd learned to see myself clearly. Their recognition was gratifying, but it was no longer necessary for my sense of purpose or self-worth. I'd found validation in the work itself, and in my own commitment to authentic creative expression. The girl who had been called too dramatic for crying over their dismissal had become a woman whose emotional intelligence and technical skills were contributing to cultural conversations that would outlast any individual career. That transformation hadn't happened because of their eventual support, or despite their initial skepticism. It had happened because I'd learned to trust internal creative instincts over external pressures, to find meaning in the process of making art rather than just in responses to finished work. Standing in my grandfather's studio 1 year after the Meridian acquisition, surrounded by new paintings that explored themes of recognition, authenticity, and artistic development, I felt deeply grateful for the journey that had brought me to this point. The space still smelled like turpentine and coffee, still held the energy of countless hours spent in conversation about creativity and cultural contribution, but now it also held evidence of artistic growth that had been worth every moment of doubt. Every family dinner where my work was dismissed, every gallery rejection that had forced me to strengthen my commitment to authentic creative expression. The paintings surrounding me were technically accomplished and conceptually ambitious, but more importantly, they were necessary expressions of ideas and emotions that couldn't be communicated any other way. The real victory wasn't in external recognition or family reconciliation, though both were welcome. The real victory was in having developed the artistic vision and personal strength necessary to contribute something meaningful to ongoing cultural conversations about landscape, memory, identity, and the complex relationships between personal experience and broader social understanding. My phone buzzed with a text from Riley about another exhibition opportunity, but I let it wait. This moment, surrounded by work that felt authentic and necessary, was too valuable to interrupt with professional obligations. Tomorrow would bring new conversations about career development and artistic growth, but tonight I allowed myself to feel proud of having stayed true to creative vision, when it would have been easier to compromise. The dramatic girl my family had worried about had become an artist whose work would outlast the opinions of anyone who had ever questioned its value. That transformation hadn't required their permission or their understanding, though their eventual recognition had been gratifying. It had required only persistent commitment to authentic creative expression, and faith in the cultural value of art that explored complex emotional and intellectual territory. The real drama was just beginning. But now I was writing from a position of strength rather than seeking validation from people whose limitations had never been my responsibility to overcome. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.